Trends in Disability Employment,
or nTIDE,
Lunch and Learn series.
Just a few housekeeping items before we begin.
This webinar is being recorded.
We will post an archive of each webinar each month on our website at www.researchondisability.org/nTIDE.
This site will also provide copies of the presentations, the speakers' bios, full transcripts, and other valuable resources.
As an attendee of this webinar, you are a viewer.
To ask questions of the speakers, click on the Q&A box on your webinar screen and type your questions into the box.
Speakers will review these questions and provide answers during the last section of the webinar.
Some questions may be answered directly in the Q&A box.
If you have any questions following this recording, please contact us at disability.statistics@unh.edu
or toll free at 866-538-9521 for more information.
Thanks for joining us.
Enjoy today's webinar.
Hi everybody, this is Andrew Haltonville. You're getting to see probably a little bit about how we do the closed captioning cart. It's basically two separate screens in on a desktop that I control remotely. So Ferris runs that desktop, and he had to resize and restart that the window that holds the cart transcription. So today's Lunch and Learn, as always, is a joint effort between the University of Hampshire, Kessler Foundation, and AUCD. We're always on at noontime on the first Friday of the month, following the release of the nTIDE report, which went out this morning. It's part of the Rehabilitation Research and Training Center on Disability on Employment Policy and Measurement, which is funded by the National Institute on Disability, Independent Living, and Rehabilitation Research, known as NIDLR. So we're going to have three parts as always. Elaine is going to replace John O'Neill when we talk about the numbers. Denise Rozelle from AUCD is going to give the nTIDE news. And we're lucky to have guest speaker Nicole Doric from the ARC. And then we're going, as we've been doing the last few seasons, we're going to hold Q&A till the end. So go ahead and take it away, Elaine.
Okay, so the monthly nTIDE report is a press release and an infographic, and we look at the latest employment statistics. And we use statistics from the jobs report, which comes out the first Friday of the month from the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics. Next slide. And the USBLS produces a survey called the Current Population Survey, which is really the source of the official unemployment rate. And it looks at and asks individuals aged 60 to 64 not living in institutions a group of questions. And starting in September 2008, they added 6 disability questions, which helps us form the data for the nTIDE. Although the survey data yet is not seasonally adjusted, which is why we look year over year. So that's it for about the source of the data. Back to you, Andrew.
Okay, so the numbers. We should have a drum roll recording. So this month from last year has been pretty flat for both people with and without disabilities, although improving a little bit more for people with disabilities than as opposed to people without disabilities. So the employment to population ratio, which is the percentage who are working, went up basically a full percentage point from 79.7 to 30.7, while this indicator went up just very slightly for people without disabilities from 74.2 to 74.5%, so 0.3 percentage points. We also look at the labor force participation rate. This is not only the percentage who are working, but also the percentage that are looking for work. And so the inverse of this, if you take 100 minus this number, are the percentage of people out of the labor force. So this number went up also for people with disabilities, although a little more slightly than the employment to population ratio. So the labor force participation rate went up from 32.2% to 32.8%. For people without disabilities, it also went up slightly from 76.8 to 77.1%. So if we look at our trend that we've been following, again, it starts, as Elaine mentioned, it starts in 2008. That's when they added the disability questions. that was based on an executive order 10 years earlier to kind of design and implement a disability set of questions. And so there are 6 questions used by the Bureau of Labor Statistics to identify the population with disabilities. And what we see is the Great Recession hitting both people with and without disabilities in 2008 and into 2009. But you see from 2009 onward a recovery for people without disabilities. The recovery really didn't start kicking in, you could even say till, say, 2016. This decline in 2014 and 13 is quite a strike, but you can really kind of see a flatness to the employment to population ratio for people with disabilities, and it really didn't start picking up until say mid 2016, and it's kind of flattened off over the last few months. We've really kind of not seen any of these big increases that we saw in 2016 and 17. If we snap in a trend line, you can kind of see this a little bit more. You see the decline for people without disabilities and then the slow recovery. And this is kind of what's always been meant by the slow Obama recovery. It really didn't reach the same levels that it had in 2008 for quite a while. And then for people with disabilities, again, we didn't start seeing this kind of turnaround until 15, 16. And then we see it kind of leveling off. Now this kind of snaps in a potential downturn, but this is still kind of fitting into a few months, basically a year of data this kind of downturn is predicting. So we really want to track this over for a few more months before we can say that it's stopped, that it's leveling off or even declining. So basically what we've seen is this kind of leveling off over the last year. And so what this really, if I had, I could probably put a little bit of more effort into this diagram to show that, this is where we're at full employment, right? So the unemployment rate is down to below 4%. And, we see that people with disabilities really benefited during the initial parts of full employment of the economy, but that kind of benefit has leveled off. And so maybe next time I'll put in a little shaded area for when the economy went into full employment. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Denise. Denise, with the news, take it away.
So Art, now that you've turned off my camera, it won't let me go on again. There it goes.
There we go.
Yay, thank you. Okay, so let's go to the first slide, Andrew. As usual around here, I try to start off with a bit of the federal policy update. I'll tell you, I'm going to skim through the second section of this because we have, as our speaker today, a real federal policy expert who's going to be talking about some of these things. So I'll kind of touch on it, but then go on. So let's start with budget appropriations. Interestingly enough, the House actually is working on budget and appropriations. We've been telling people for quite some time that we thought we were going to end up with CR, and despite the fact that they're doing some of the work, but maybe not. You've heard me talk before on these calls about, and you probably know the term an omnibus. An omnibus is when they roll instead of voting on each of the appropriations bills separately, defense, labor age, energy, etc., pass them through one house, send them to the other house, pass them to the second house, have the president sign them. Instead of doing it that way with an omnibus, they roll everything into one big bill. So kind of something like that. It looks like it's happening, except what they call it is a minibus. Got it? Omnibus, minibus. Okay, so there's a minibus that they're working on in the House that it should be marked up, and they're hoping to pass by the end of June. And the minibus includes the defense appropriations bill, the labor HHS appropriations, labor HHS education, which is where most of the things that folks on this call care about, not that we don't also care about defense and other things. Energy, water, state foreign relations, and legislative. Those 5 appropriations bills look like they're going to be folded into one bill, which the House is going to mark up, and they're actually working on the amendments for it right now. So that means they're actually moving toward a markup. that they'll mark up and then hopefully pass by late in June. And then the idea is that minibus will go over to the Senate side, and hopefully the Senate takes up that bill as a whole, and they're actually hoping to pass that by July. So that is big news. If that happens, that's big news. Now I will also, and as I say, we have a speaker, Nicole Doric is a real federal policy expert, and she may have something to add about what she's hearing on this as well. It's kind of odd because I told you last month that they haven't been going through the regular process, meaning like nobody's talking about sequestration and nobody's talking about the budget caps and nobody's talking, but they're passing appropriations bills, which one should be, I mean, they should go together, but we'll wait and see. It is good news that they're moving forward. It's good news that we should have it looks like a labor HHS ed bill that actually is part of this minibus and passes before the end of the session. So those don't go into a CR. Well, again, this is all really kind of strange. So we'll wait and see what happens. I would welcome Nicole's comments on this when it gets to her. Other things that are going on, and this is part of what Nicole is focused on, so I'm going to kind of skim through. There are a lot of things going on right now around employment and competitive integrated employment. And the connections to long-term services and supports. The new one for this month that you haven't heard about yet is called the Capability Act. And I had to pull out what it stands for because, you know, we here in Washington are all about our acronyms. So it was introduced by Representative Seth Moulton, who's a Democrat from Massachusetts, and Representative Kathy McMorris Rogers, who is a representative from Washington State. So it's a bipartisan bill. And it stands for Customized Approaches to Providing and Building Independent Lives for Inclusion for Transition Age Youth Act of 2019. Yeah, okay, so the acronym is Capability, and that's how you'll be hearing about it. It is a different bite of the apple as versus the transformation to competitive employment and some of the others. It looks at youth, transition age youth, and it provides some funding for transition age youth with specific disabilities. This is, like I said, it's one bite of the apple. So it applies to transition age youth with intellectual disabilities, significant disabilities. I believe mental health is also involved in that. And it's targeting customized employment for transition age youth in those categories. And it does provide some grants to states, as does Transformation to Competitive Employment, some grants to states for that particular subpopulation. When we talked to the folks from Representative McMorris Rogers' office, who we actually just had a meeting with this week, their feeling was this is just one more way of attacking this issue. And we'll see which ones go through and which ones don't and how it all folds together in the long run. But keep an eye, that's a new one. Oh, and it's I wrote it down, H3070. There is not a companion bill in the Senate to my knowledge, although, again, Nicole can correct me if I'm wrong. Okay, next slide, Andrew. So another thing that's going on right now, and I think Nicole's gonna hit on it too, but frankly, you should hear this twice because it is that important. Once at the beginning and once at the end from Nicole. There is currently a national online dialogue going on. Oh, my 14C turned out to be 14 copyright. Clearly my spell check likes copyright. Okay, there's a national online dialogue going on about perspectives on 14C of the Fair Labor Standards Act. As I'm sure folks on this call know, 14C is the subminimum wage. You know, the goal of ODEP, which is who's running this national dialogue, is to gather information from the ground about perspectives on 14C and subminimum wage and sheltered work to some extent. And there is a link here. You are all invited to share your stories. National APSE has created a tutorial on how to do that because it's a little complicated on how you do it and actually walk through the processes of filing your comments. What I need to say to you is that right now, this is incredibly important. It only runs through, oh, I didn't put that on the side. It only runs through June 14th. This is a do it today kind of a thing. And just go in and file your comments. We need to have people file comments on good experiences of competitive integrated employment. We need more people filing comments. We need more self-advocates filing comments about employment, what they want to do with their life in their employment, what their dreams are. We need more people filing comments on the importance of earning a minimum wage or above. right now, and you, depending on what the perspective is that you bring to this call, I will tell you that right now, the comments are running, and you can look at the comments. You can go online and actually look at the comments that are being filed as well. I will tell you as of right now, the comments are running massively in favor of keeping 14C and in favor of continuing sheltered work. So you can take that and understand what I'm telling you, whatever your position is. I urge you to go online and file it. And again, you'll hear it again at the end of this. Is important, folks. Okay, next slide. Interestingly enough, because we have a variety of, I mean, this whole call is about employment, but it also, we seem to have a variety of stuff popping up right now to share with you around competitive integrated employment, employment first, all of that. The new issue of, it's a special issue of the Journal of Vocational Rehabilitation for the May 2019 are the proceedings from the APSE conference last year. And there are a couple of there are many really good articles in it. There are many really good articles in it. But two of them specifically look at employment first, and I found really useful because I think the first one is about using the high-performing states model to facilitate employment first in Florida. I really like this because it's a case study of a state who's doing it. They're talking about how they did their strategic planning, what that looked like. It's one thing to decide you're going to be an employment first state. It's another thing to figure out how to do it. And so I thought that was fascinating, and it's a really good article. The second one on using data to advance employment first talks about some of the data, and for this call particularly, since you folks are data folks and interested in data, it talks about where the data is out there already and what data sets you can use to forward this the employment first opportunity in states. I've said to you all before, I'm very much a state government person. I come out of that background, and there is a lot of work going on competitive integrated employment in states right now. So they're kind of the catalyst for all the change. Well, not all the change. Much of the change that's happening right now is happening in states. So I really urge you to look at those. There are a bunch of other good articles in this JVR edition. I didn't list them all here because I was focusing on employment first, but I really, and for those of you who may not have a subscription to JVR, you can print them all out. They're all printable, the PDFs, the full articles. I know I've had questions from folks on this call before about how to get articles when you have to have a subscription. That's not true for these, and they're really well done. Okay, the other thing on employment first, ODEP's community of practice. And first of all, let me say, if you're not a member of the ODEP community of practice on employment and employment first, and I would urge you to do that. There's a way to join, and probably if you link in the link here I'm providing, you can get there. But they have developed a state strategic plan. It's a toolkit on state strategic planning for employment first. And it's about tools and strategies, and what they're looking for is feedback. So they want to know, look at the manual, see what you think, give us feedback. And there's a specific feedback form that I also gave you the link for. And again, given the people on this call, I really urge you to look at it and give them the comments. They're looking for improving this and for helping states do the work that states are trying to do right now on employment first. So that's an important one too. Not that all of these aren't important. Okay, the next one. I thought this would be good just to share quickly on, next slide, Andrew. He's getting there. There you go.
You didn't say next slide. You said the next one.
Okay, next slide, Andrew. Thank you. That's a good one. Thank you. So Disability In was our speaker last month. Jill Houghton was on the call last month, and they have come out with a press release this month and some statements about things they're doing. I thought would be just interesting to share with you. There's a national investor group which includes like $1 trillion worth of investments, and it's institutional investors. It's like the California Retirement Fund, pension funds, and they have combined, that group, which has over $1 trillion of investments, has combined calling for disability inclusion, and they're calling for it, highlighting the financial benefits of an open and diverse workforce. And I thought this was really interesting. There are two nice quotes. I just put them here so you can see them. It's in partnership with AAPD and somebody else. It's Disability and AAPD and somebody else, but probably all of these investors. So the quote is, "This new concerted effort on corporate and shareholder engagement and accountability catapults the issue of disability inclusion into the forefront of corporate, social responsibility, and environmental, social, and corporate governance. E.g., I bet that should be E.g., investing. Flip to the next slide, please, Andrew. I think it's a really nice, oh, Accenture was the third. I think it's a really nice perspective that we haven't looked at before. The more times we can look at disability inclusion from the employer, from the investor, from the financial, all of those issues, I think becomes really important. This one from the investment side, we want to know that our investment dollars are being used to maximize a company's potential and its long-term profitability. Disability inclusion expands the pool of talent companies can hire from and creates welcoming workplaces that foster different perspectives, giving an enterprise a competitive edge. I love that quote. We need to be talking more about this as the competitive edge within business. So I just thought this was really nice. And so Jill was our speaker last month. I wanted to give you a link, and the link is to a report from last year that Accenture, Disability In, and APD did around the advantage. Okay, next slide, Andrew. On the same kind of topic on corporate social responsibility, I thought this was also an interesting article. It's in a journal I'm not familiar with called Corporate Social Responsibility and Environmental Management. And it's about socially responsible human resources practices to improve the employability of people with disabilities. Since we here at AUCD do a lot of, we've been involved in a lot of international employment work lately, particularly around both with our State Department fellows, and you'll remember Sarah DeMeo came in and spoke about the State Department Fellowship of professional fellows with disabilities on inclusive employment back in, I think, January. So anyway, we do that work, and the Harkin Summit. So what we have seen is a lot of really interesting job training, corporate social responsibility, interesting practices. This one actually is from a hotel in Hong Kong who is training individuals with intellectual disabilities. And what they did was they interviewed the staff and the social workers, and the study suggests that socially responsible human resources practices can play an important role in improving the employability of people with disabilities. And again, both from the international point of view and from the kind of corporate social responsibility point of view, I thought this was a nice one and wanted to share it with you. Okay, next slide. Since May was Mental Health Month, there is a variety of mental health resources that have shown up in the last month that I wanted to make sure you knew about. Workforce GPS, we've talked about Workforce GPS before. They are the folks who do all of the resources available for the American Job Centers. And so they've got a whole workplace resources page they've updated for mental health, for folks with mental health. It's called Workforce Resources for Mental Health. Then EARN, which is also an ODEP-funded project, and there's a webpage called EARN, came out with a mental health toolkit and resources for fostering a mentally healthy workforce. I thought this one was interesting too, because it's not just it's human resources stuff. And I thought that was fascinating. It talks about accommodations, it talks about model successful programs, but it also talked about strengthening the mental health programs in your health plan. How many of us don't, and how many businesses don't really come at it and come at mental health services and programs from that point of view? So I thought that was a fascinating piece to it too. And again, it's an ODEP-sponsored website and ODEP-sponsored materials, so you can look those up too. Next slide, Andrew. I flipped my slides. Okay, that's perfect. So a couple of things to tell you about that are happening this month. This one is a webinar on rural job development, Maine and Tennessee experiences. Again, this is part of that ODEP Employment First Community of Practice that I talked about earlier, and is specifically targeted to rural job development and specifically case studies from Maine and Tennessee. So I thought that was a nice one. There's lots of conversation going around rural development. So I thought you might be interested in that. It's a webinar, June 12th, 3 to 4 Eastern. The link for how to sign up is in that first bullet point. Next slide, Andrew. This is a cool one. If you haven't heard about this, this is very cool. The folks at Nicole are doing campaign training for people with disabilities. This is people with disabilities who want to run for office. And I thought this was, it's a whole nother level that we have not done necessarily a great job at. So it's a 5-week campaign training series. They've got expert political consultants, not disability-specific political consultants. Like I said, sponsored by Nicole. And they're looking at the stuff you need to run a campaign. You need operations, you need communications, you got to do fundraising. How do you do voter outreach? So if you're interested in this one, or if you know anybody who's interested in running for office, or frankly, it's just kind of interesting to know how campaigns work if you're a political geek, there's the link. Go to nickel.org /elevate, and they'll give you updates. They'll give you more information. You can register for it. I really hope they get a big output for this, because there's lots of opportunity out there, and there are lots of good folks with disabilities who could be running and changing. Talk about systems change from the bottom up. That's a good way to do it. Okay, next slide, Andrew. I think I'm almost, one more input. Okay, this is another one where the ADA National Network is looking for input on outreach support, to inform their outreach support, that's the way to say it, for people with disabilities, particularly those who they're trying to reach a population of people with disabilities who are Latino or Hispanic and older. They want to figure out, how do you outreach into those communities? What are we doing right? What are we doing wrong? What's the best way? How do you access information? If you're in any of those communities, how do older adults access information? How do folks who are Latino or Hispanic access information? And what are the needs if that's not being met, or even if it is being met now? But there's always ways we can improve. So this is another one where I think for anybody who wants to go in and respond, these are the links. There's a questionnaire that goes with it. And I would urge you to go in. I think it's a great way to have input into the work that we are all doing. And it's a great way for all of us to learn how to better outreach to some of the communities that we are not always good, where we're not always good at doing that. So that's the end of what I've got for today. I get the pleasure of introducing our speaker. If you want to flip to the next slide, Andrew. Nicole Doric is our speaker today. She is the Senior Director of Public Policy at the ARC. I want to personally thank Nicole for stepping in. Ellison Barkoff was originally going to be our speaker. Ellison had a family emergency, and Nicole, at the very last minute, was willing to step in. When Ellison told me that Nicole was the person she had asked to do this, my immediate first reaction was, oh my gosh, that's perfect. Nicole has the knowledge, has the background, works on all of these issues. So as you recall, we are in the middle of a series of 3 speakers, 3 months in a row, around competitive integrated employment. So Jill Houghton last month, Nicole this month, talking more from the policy side, and then our speaker next month as well. Nicole is an accomplished special education attorney, and her background, Nicole's done a lot of stuff, includes employment at a provider for individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities, affiliations with local and national organizations, working on public policy issues, and designing and implementing a repertoire of other work. She has been involved as an attorney. She's been involved in the states. As a matter of fact, when I heard Nicole was speaking today, I went out of my way to say, hey, because I know you do a lot of state work, if there's anything you want to add from the state perspective, feel free to do that. I am really thrilled to be introducing Nicole today, and I'm going to toss it to you, Nicole.
Thanks so much, Denise. What a very nice introduction. I really appreciate it. And I'm happy to be with you all today in Allison's stead, and I will be using Allison's slides. So luckily we work together a lot on things on the Hill from both a lobbying and policy perspective. So happy to be with you all today. And so we can go to the next slide. I think whenever we're talking, we can go to the next slide. Whenever we're talking about employment for people with disabilities, it's really important to begin with the end in mind and think about what the vision is for people with disabilities. Obviously, we need quality supports, we need real integration, and people to have real work and real pay. That's the vision we should have for all people with disabilities or unemployment, including those with the most significant needs. Next slide. In order to have the vision of full community inclusion for all people with disabilities overall, employment is really the key. One of the things I did is I ran the Employment First initiative for the state of Illinois. And one of the things that we always talked about in our meetings and as we were moving the strategic plan forward around employment was that really employment can be the linchpin for a successful life in the community. It adds a layer of safety in that, if you don't show up to your job for a few days, people notice. There's all these intangible things that come from having an answer to what do you do during the day, not only as in the form of self-esteem and satisfaction, but it does have those other components of supporting integration, helping people to access the community, facilitating relationships outside of staff and family. And so that's why we have to continue to build infrastructure and capacity for community employment. Next slide. This is, as Denise already sort of framed in a really great way, it's a really critical time for the community to come together to advocate for disability employment. We have to continue to implement some regulatory pieces, which I'll get into. Also, we have to make sure that we don't see any rollbacks of some successes that we have had, specifically in the area of the definition of competitive integrated employment. And also we have to continue to work with Congress on legislation to advance competitive integrated employment. And I'll cover quickly some of the same bills that Denise had talked about earlier and talk about what we can do there. Next slide. The first bill that we really need to talk about as we're discussing employment from a federal policy perspective is the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act. Next slide. The Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act, or WIOA, which I'll call it now, was passed in 2014, and it really prioritizes and increases the focus on employment for people with disabilities in competitive integrated employment. It's the first time that competitive integrated employment had been defined in law, so that in and of itself was really exciting, and it's also why we have to be careful about any potential pushbacks on that. There's also a clear statutory goal to limit the use of 14C certificates, the part of the Fair Labor Standards Act that allows people with disabilities to be paid less than the minimum wage. It including requiring for transition-aged youth to close the pipeline between schools and sheltered workshops. There's a specific goal in the legislation that anyone under the age of 24 must have the opportunity to explore CIE before they're referred to that sort of placement. It also required 15% of VR, or vocational rehabilitation dollars, to be spent on transition-aged youth, and also had a focus on supporting those with the most significant needs. The WIOA also recognized the importance of cross-agency collaboration. I know from my time working at the state level that some of what can stall a lot of progress in any systems change is the siloed services that can occur. So WIOA required memorandums of understanding or MOUs between the agencies that oversee employment in any given state, including the VR agency, the state Medicaid agency, the DD agency in any given state, and the Department of Education. And this has been, next slide. I know from talking to my state chapters all over the country and the other work that I do in employment that, we're really seeing a lot of positive things come from the implementation of WIOA. And one of the biggest reasons for that is the fact that these agencies are starting to sit down and have opportunities to have conversations like, how do we braid funding? How do we blend funding to make employment a desired outcome for the service system? We're also seeing we have to continue to push states on the implementation, because interagency collaboration is great, but we also have to make sure that the opportunities are there for everyone, again, including those with the most significant disabilities. So we really do need to continue to do work to build the capacity. And there's some opportunities there with some of the legislation that Denise talked about, and I'll hammer home a little bit more later. But so those capacity building dollars will really assist in the continued implementation of WIOA. Next slide. I've mentioned a couple times that there are some concerns around the regulatory process of WIOA. The WIOA regulations were finalized at the end of 2016. However, there's been a push from some providers of segregated sheltered workshops and others about the definition of competitive integrated employment. There's a big reason for this is there's some question as to whether Ability One jobs would be competitive integrated employment, and whether some jobs that are more what we would consider jobs that are completed in enclaves or one group of people with disabilities that moves together without the building or throughout the building, whether or not those types of things would be those types of jobs would be considered competitive integrated employment. So that's next slide. The disability community has come together around this issue to push back on the folks that might be working to reopen the regulations, because we feel that any questions that VR agencies or states may have could be done through additional FAQs or regulatory guidance versus reopening the regs. It sends a really dangerous precedent to reopen a reg over 2 years after it was finalized, let alone over 4 years after the bill, or excuse me, 5 years after the bill was originally passed. I mean, we're already having conversations on the Hill about reauthorizing WIOA, so it's really frustrating that we're having to make sure that the regulations stand strong. But we have the next slide. We've continued to work with the Department of Education, met with Secretary DeVos and other leadership, again, bringing home the fact that we can, if there are these concerns, that there's other ways to handle them. But unfortunately, we do continue to see it being noticed in the regulatory agenda for the Department of Education. And so until the reg comes out, we're going to continue to assume that it will. I tend to be one of the more optimistic ones in the coalitions that we work with, and I'm hoping that we can avoid it because of some of the meetings that we've had, but it's not for certain. And so it's really important to stay aware and stay engaged. And next slide, you'll see at the bottom of the page the website for integratedemploymentnow.org. This is the website of a group, the Coalition to Advance Competitive Integrated Employment. The ARC is a member, AUCD is a member, a lot of, Ellison is one of the leaders of the group. And that's where you'll be able to see if the NPM does come out or the notice for proposed rulemaking does come out. It's going to be critical to make sure that the voices supporting competitive integrated employment and supporting the continued strong implementation of WIOA are just as strong. So make sure that that's a website that you're checking out every once in a while, and we'll certainly be pushing it out, and obviously Denise will get it to everybody. Next slide. When it comes to employment services, another aspect that is very important is the implementation of the Medicaid Home and Community-Based Services Settings Rule. Next slide. The Settings Rule also came out in 2014, was kind of a big year for disability policy and regulations. It was finalized in 2014 with a 5-year transition period. And it's really the biggest way to boil down the HCBS Settings Rule is that it's about making sure that home and community-based dollars are actually being spent in the community, allowing individuals with disabilities to have interactions with their non-disabled peers, that they have access to non-disability specific settings, and that they have the right to privacy that we all want and that we all support. It can and should really be a catalyst for a lot of systems change, and that includes in the area of competitive integrated employment. Next slide. It's a lot of the conversation around the rule is around the residential side, but it has been very clear from the very beginning that the HCBS rule applies to both residential and non-residential settings. And so CMS has been really clear that it still applies to those settings, and also has been clear in some strategies that states are using as not being not coming up to par. One example is CMS has pushed back on states who want to use something called reverse integration. So, for example, if there was a sheltered workshop, bringing people without disabilities into the workshop to work, that would not be enough to show that there was true integration. That does not mean that people with disabilities can't come in and work in the workshop. It just means that it would have to be part of an array of options of how any specific setting is being intentional about community integration. Next slide. Tiered standards is something that some states are using to have flexibility for existing settings. So a transitional model for settings that currently exist, that maybe there might be a little bit more time that those settings need to come into full compliance, but for new settings that they have to meet the levels of the rule. So that's just something to keep in mind. Next slide. As you're working at the state level, I think Denise did ask me to talk a little bit about state level activity. I think in the area of employment and engaging with the HCBS settings rule process in your state is something that is actually really important to the continued growth of employment. So it's really critical to make sure that you're at the table, because even though the rule came out with a 5-year transition period, only 14 states have full approval, and 5 states don't even have initial approval. And so it's if you're wondering where your state stands, there's hcbsadvocacy.org is somewhere where you can go for state-based resources, but that's a really good way to stay engaged at the state level. Next slide. Yes, next slide. So the transformation to competitive integrated employment, I was just talking about WIOA, so I wanted to add the integrated in there, but the Transformation to Competitive Employment Act, or HR 873 or Senate Bill 260, was introduced in the Senate by Senator Casey and in the House by Representative McMorris Rogers. And I'm forgetting the lead Democrat, and of course, Representative Bobby Scott from Virginia. It's the first bill. There's been bills in the past to just straight up eliminate 14C of the Fair Labor Standard Act with varying transition periods for that phase out. This is the first bill that combined eliminating 14C with capacity building dollars. It would allow for 10 states to get grants for provider transformation, and if a provider is in a state where the state does not apply for the grant, individual providers can also apply. There's a lot of activity on the Hill around this issue. Just on Wednesday, there was a House briefing and a Senate briefing on this bill, so that was an exciting moment for the community to have more information. There were folks from providers who have closed their workshops. There was the court monitor from one of the DOJ settlement agreements around employment. And so we're hoping to see some movement on that legislation. Next slide. In addition, as I said, this was the Transformation to Competitive Employment Act was the first time to combine the elimination and the capacity building, but there are bills in this Congress to just straight up eliminate 14C, and one of those is the Raise the Wage Act, which is a broad broad wage bill, but the 14C component is included. And then there in the past, the bills to eliminate 14C was called the Time Act. In addition, we'll anticipate Transition to Independence Act that's noted on this slide. We do anticipate that to be reintroduced this Congress. I'm actually working on that next week. And that is a bill that would provide bonus payments to states that moved individuals that are currently in segregated settings into community employment or integrated day services. Next slide. It's really important that you know anytime you're talking about any particular issue, it's really important as you're educating your members of Congress to tell the stories, not only any stories that you know, but particularly I would highlight any stories you have of individuals who are have more significant needs. Folks really on the Hill really need to understand that employment is a possibility for all individuals, and make sure that that you ask them to co-sponsor some of the legislation that we talked about, including the bills that I just talked about. And I didn't mention the Capability Act because Denise had, but that is another really exciting piece of legislation. Next slide. I'm going to power through these because I know I'm at time. But at the state level, there is also a lot of activity going on around 14C. Maryland passed a bill to eliminate the use of 14C. Kentucky and Illinois are both working on it at the state level. So make sure that you're aware and you're tapped into your disability networks about what's going on in your state. Denise already mentioned this, and it is so important it is important enough to highlight it again, but it's really critical, next slide, that you take the time to share your views on 14C on the current listening session that the Office of Disability Employment Policy is currently running, because the other folks that support the continuation of these services are organized in force, and so it's really important that those supporting competitive integrated employment are just as strong. Next slide. In these slides, and I encourage you to take a look at them more closely, there's some specific breakdowns that Ellison gives on how you can tell your specific story based on whether the fact that you're a family member, employer, so definitely take a look. And then next slide and next slide. I'm just gonna, these are Allison's slides, but I'm lucky enough to know Allison's brother, Evan, who's noted in this, and Evan is actually here speaking at the disability policy seminar at a session that I planned, where he was talking about his life in the community and the job that he has working at a local fitness center and what that's meant for his life. And so I know that Ellison, even though he's not my brother, I want to make sure to share this part. I also am a sibling. My brother, Chris, is actually just starting the employment process. And so as a family member too, this is so important. And so that's why we have to continue to educate Congress. We also have to continue to push back on regulatory proposed changes and make sure that our voices are heard in the 14C conversation. Okay, and now I will turn it back over.
Okay, great. So we have about 13 minutes for, sorry, I have to move my microphone back. I'll turn on my video. So we have about 13 minutes for questions and answers, and you can enter them in the chat area of the webcast, and also the Q&A section. I have a question for you, Nicole. One thing, so there are a lot of people that are for and against there are a lot of people who are opposed to getting rid of 14C designations. Can you give some of the primary concerns that they may have?
Sure. And if you don't mind, if you want to go to the last slide, because it has a bunch of good links and stuff, so I just want to make sure that that's up there for folks. These are great pictures of Evan, but that's what we need to see. Yes, and so that's certainly something that I've dealt with at the state level when we were working on Employment First, and also at the federal level. And I will say that in our chapter network, we have a variety of different thinking. And so that's a conversation that we have a lot. I think that honestly, the biggest concern is based on a lack of understanding of what community employment can look like. And family members who maybe oppose this sort of transition, not being able to see their family member in a job. And so I think the most important thing to do is to make sure that there's family-to-family support, because the strongest advocates I've found for shifting away from sheltered workshops were most often the ones who were the most strongly opposed to that change. And so I think some of the reasons are about safety, and that these are programs that people have sometimes been in for decades, and they don't want to leave their friends. And that's all really understandable. But I think something that I should have mentioned that's really important to remember and understand when we're talking about this is that 14C was always meant to be a temporary situation for any individual. They were never meant to be places where somebody was for 20 years. That is how the cookie crumbled because of, lack of capacity in the community and also societal lack of expectations for people with disabilities. And so I think sometimes even in my own family, we can get stuck in what our limited thinking for an individual with a disability. And I think that's honestly the biggest hurdle. And that's why we have to support families to see beyond what their limited expectations might be.
Right. Yeah, so it was really meant for rehabilitation. It was a process of rehabilitation that someone would then transition into. Just something that comes to my mind, just based on some personal experiences, that Medicaid coverage is really quite important. And I've had friends that have had to manage their child's hours, their adult child's hours at a job she loves, to say, give less hours. With a great employer, Wegmans in the Northeast. And they had to ask to cut back hours because she was earning too much. And I wondered, is there some I've never heard this, but is there a pushback against 14C because it could raise earnings and therefore threaten Medicaid eligibility?
I haven't heard it in that context because generally we're not talking about the wages in community employment are going to be higher, so that's where the conversation's happening. But we are hearing that concern overall because minimum wages are raising in other places, and so even if someone is working a minimum wage job, that because of the SGA level, that they have to cut hours and that sort of thing. I haven't heard that in the context of concerns around sheltered work, although I'm sure it is one. I think generally there is, we have to continue to support wage growth for obviously individuals with disabilities, but we also have to work on a fix to the SGA level. It's something that we're working on at the ARC right now, actually.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I could see those going hand in hand. The idea of getting rid of 14C, and it sounds like there's money to be had to make that transition, and adding that to a bill and adding kind of what's next is for the families and how they can manage that transition is crucial.
That's interesting. I'm gonna keep that in mind as I move forward because I haven't necessarily thought of pairing those issues completely, and it makes a lot of sense.
So if I do know some families who are against getting rid of 14C. Now, I'm not sure they quite fully understand everything, but what they know is that they have to manage very carefully the earnings that their adult child, who's living independently, but they're still involved with trying to manage the person's earnings to make sure that they don't run afoul. And Medicaid appears to be much more problematic than Social Security, in part because Social Security is on a quarterly basis and easier to manage, whereas earnings for Medicaid and Medicare are monthly.
Well, that depends on
the state.
Yeah,
it depends on the state they're in. It's monthly. So, I guess having those two tied together. Although moving Social Security and Medicaid policy is a much bigger ask than,
Yeah, but it is something that we're working on because a lot of these conversations, I can't talk about anything without talking about Medicaid.
Right.
Not just because it's one of the issue areas that I cover as well as employment, but because obviously protecting Medicaid impacts employment directly. When we had the big cuts that we were facing in 2017, between $800 billion and $1 trillion over 10 years, depending on which version of things you were looking at, the first place that those cuts were going to come was to home and community-based services because of the optional nature of those programs versus the mandatory nature of institutional services, nursing home, and other healthcare.
Right.
And I heard state DD directors saying that they were going to have to cut their whole employment program. And so in order to protect opportunities for employment, we also have to protect Medicaid, but that does include also looking at how we can make Medicaid easier and more flexible for families and for individuals.
Yeah.
So this is Elaine. I just want to interject that New Jersey has something called workability, which allows you to earn upwards of $60,000 and still be eligible for Medicaid. So some other states may have some sort of other integration where you can work fully and still keep your Medicaid and benefits, which tends to be an issue.
And also ABLE accounts are really an important tool, and that's why the ABLE Age Bill, the ABLE Age Adjustment Act, is also a really important tool to support employment, because the ABLE funds don't come into consideration for Social Security, Medicaid, and just recently HUD also came out with clear guidance that it also wouldn't impact HUD benefits.
Yeah, we have a question from online. Is what are Ability One jobs?
Oh, thank you. And sorry, we live in a world of alphabet and acronyms and everything else, so sorry about that. But Ability One is a federal program run through several nonprofits, including Source America, where people with disabilities are under contract to work in places like military bases. There's Ability One jobs on the Hill. They're oftentimes cleaning crews. So they're federally, it's a federal program, and there are also conversations starting about how to modernize that program. But when I say Ability One, those are the kind of jobs that I'm talking about that folks are concerned wouldn't count as competitive integrated employment.
Yeah. Are Ability One jobs, so are Ability One jobs all 14C?
No, actually, they're very, they first of all, I have to, Ability One came out in 2016 with a proclamation that none of their contracts would pay less than federal minimum wage. Yeah. And so they are moving towards that. And actually so the very low percentage of their job are 14C.
Yeah. It's
not so much the wage issue there. It's the issue of the model of employment, whether or not there's true integration.
Sure. In terms of 14C type jobs, another question is what type of jobs are they typically?
Generally, not always, but generally 14C certificates are used in sheltered workshops. So a lot of those types of jobs are, sorting different things. There were a lot of recycling, technology recycling programs, kind of more manufacturing type jobs is what you think of. When I ran a provider association in Illinois, there were some of my members had places where they made license plates. I mean, those were the types of jobs that are oftentimes done in sheltered workshops. Yeah. And part of what is troubling and part of what we have to think about when we're talking about sub-minimum wage generally is, first of all, that it was created in the 1930s during a much different time and obviously a much different economic standpoint. Not only was it meant to be temporary, but it was also based on those manufacturing jobs where, you're being paid based on productivity. Well, I don't know about you, but I don't think that I wouldn't want to be paid based on my productivity some days. And also we'd have to be looking at making sure that we're finding the right jobs. So if somebody's unproductive, why aren't we talking about the fact that it might not be the right placement and it might not be the right job? Those are the sort of conversations we have at the state level.
Yeah, because they have to submit paperwork to show that somebody is not productive in that job and in order to get the certificate.
Yeah, and that's how people can sometimes be paid like pennies literally on the hour.
I think one question is, are the firms creating a business model for which it's not just that type of job and whether something can be done differently. It's whether the firms are setting up jobs in response to the availability of the certificates.
Yeah.
Could they be going towards labor-intensive processes in order to have these it's a sticky situation.
Yeah, I'd like to think it's not that bad, but
I think that there are different intentions. The intention is probably good, but maybe old-fashioned.
Exactly. I was gonna say. I think it's an antiquated in many ways. It's antiquated, quite literally, but also and it gets in the way so the funding that goes there could be reinvested in community employment and community integrated day services in a way that would impact a lot more people.
Yeah.
But there is a lot of fear around that. And so we have to have understanding of that and move forward, but we have to focus on capacity building.
Yeah. Yeah, they're all pretty antiquated in the sense that Social Security was in the same period of time, developed in, the 30s and 20s, so we're looking at long-standing programs that assume people can't work, or work productively. Okay, well, we're at 12 o'clock, 1 o'clock. Thank you very much, Nicole. Thank you, Denise and Elaine. Elaine substituted for John, did an awesome job. All right, so that's it for today. You have the contact information. Please feel free to contact us if you don't know where the information is. And thanks again, Nicole.
Thank you.
Bye-bye, everybody.